So up next we have Lucy Hardcastle, is an interdisciplinary designer and digital artist living in London. Her work focuses on tactility, visual illusions, and sensual aesthetics, that's a mouthful. Through digitally rendered pieces, sculpture, set design, and moving image, Lucy's worked alongside world-leading brands such as Chanel, Nike, Alexander Wang, and Levi's. And her current projects aim to bridge the highly digital and physical aspects of her practice to produce immersive experiential pieces. I look forward to seeing lots of beautiful things very shortly. But I'll hand you over to Lucy. Thank you.
So hi everyone, thank you so much for that introduction. That was a great explanation of what I do. I think I would describe myself as kind of a digital artist and a creative director within my studio, but also a general interdisciplinary person. This is just a snippet of the kind of work that I create, but I would say that I'm best known for creating visuals that feel digitally native. And whether that means kind of using rendering software or producing the same aesthetic but through physical objects, I try to approach both in the same way. So within my work, I really want to challenge the boundaries between what we associate with the real and the digital, and really make viewers question what we are viewing and why, and build an understanding of what this will mean for us going forward in the future with all the themes that we're kind of covering tonight. And I'd say I use technology as a gateway for innovation within my practice, and kind of try to see my work as a digital craftsmanship in itself. And my ultimate goal with my work is to try and find new forms of storytelling through digital software. And I quite often like to take things that currently exist and mesh them with other things to kind of create a new experience for the user. So before I delve into the work that I've made as a digital artist, I kind of wanted to take a few steps back and consider my childhood and my teenagehood. So when I was first asked to speak about this topic, I was trying to think of my first experience that was looking at digitally altered imagery, or at least imagery that I knew was digitally altered. And I found a photo of my childhood bedroom that was completely plastered with all these fashion images, including these two in particular. And pop culture and fashion is something that still really influences my work. And when people ask why there's so much kind of reflection and gloss within what I do, I think I kind of recall these images that were a hedonistic fantasy that to me kind of evoked glamour and success and were almost like a shield from the world in terms of retouching. So the first time that I began using rendering software myself was on my BA course, where I was actually studying textile design. And I'd started, obviously, having simple beginnings of playing around with Photoshop, and I kind of realized that there was a huge gap between what the world of advertising was using to create their images through things like rendering and CGI, and what we were producing within the textile world. So I really wanted to kind of push the boundaries of what a digital image on printed fabric could mean in terms of materiality, and whether there would be a difference between it being captured on a camera or created through a computer. So this led me to teach myself Cinema 4D, which at the time was a total niche to be applied to textiles. And it really gave me the ability to create perfect imagery, or at least perfect in my mind, without having to use lots of photography skills or traditional lighting. I essentially had total control over them. And this first interaction with Cinema 4D still completely influences my work to this day. So I also aim to provide a direct link between what you were viewing and what you were touching, and I think that's why I was drawn to working with fabric in the first place. And this kind of hyper-real imagery that references tactile textures kind of created this end result of something that felt like a new object to me. Because these kinds of rendered images that was showing 3D shapes had never been applied to a surface that itself had movement, or at least that I hadn't seen. So to this day, when I work with textile clients and I kind of show them a piece of fabric maybe on Skype that's got printed Cinema 4D on it, they're like, what is it? Like, is it three-dimensional? What's going on? So I kind of love that. As well as creating images, I started making physical objects and kind of using them to inform one another. And it really made me begin to investigate this struggle that we have with technology and handmade craft. And as humans, this idea that we always want to create perfection, and sometimes perfection could be seen as being on a higher end of the hierarchy if you've used your hands to make it. So yeah, something that it made me really think about is, what do we see as the kind of ultimate image? Is it something that we know we have complete control of, or is it something that's perfectly imperfect? So I really think with these pieces, I wasn't necessarily trying to simulate reality, but kind of find a space where it's between the fake and the reality, and there's kind of a realistic lighting, but with fantasy objects that almost provides visual escapism. So from then on, I started creating objects that pushed the flat imagery that I'd begun with, and it really felt like a natural transition to start exploring glass as a material, which I used as for my first sculptural commission, which was this really kind of plump pillow. And I love that this piece kind of gives a volume that we associate with soft and inflated materials and provides a permanent life to something that's actually just a breath of air. And I kind of had a lot of feedback that people want to cuddle and squeeze this piece, even though they know what it's made of is really hard. Another commission that I thought was really relevant was called Phygital Objects, which was for Frame magazine at Milan Design Week a few years ago. And this really brought to the forefront the conversation that I'd been having with physical and digital and how they kind of intermixed in my work. And I essentially tried to imitate rendered shapes that I was known for into a physical form. Later on, now as well, I've started working within glassblowing and teaching myself. And I think the shapes here really kind of transcend the digital. And from my experience, the act itself of creating glass through blowing is kind of this direct material connection that you have between yourself and the process. And it's really intense how the glass kind of quickly changes from liquid to caramel to these kinds of bubblegum textures. But I was doing a talk recently and someone thought that these were rendered. So that was something that was really interesting to me. And I don't think that there's any other kind of material that you could fully compare to glass, because it kind of goes through these changes of states that I feel really touches on the core of human curiosity of wanting to always alter and transform objects. And now I believe going into the third and fourth industrial revolution change our realities. More recently, I've gone further into the direction of emphasizing the real in a collaboration with the photographer Ryan Hopkinson, where we just kind of explored the movement that glass had. And I think with these images, we really wanted to challenge the meaning of CGI in photography in this kind of post-truth world that we're currently in. You know, if you are working in CGI and you get to something that appears completely real, where do you go from there? So it was really exciting to kind of create images that, for the viewer, gives this kind of organic unpredictability, but may still also have a look of digital. So these images aren't retouched at all. The ability to render a reality can often require immersive elements as well. And with things like AR and VR coming out in order to kind of create a more convincing world, I've started to rely on things like spatial context, digital materials, and sound design to create interactive pieces. So this is a project that I felt really kind of expressed a digitally rendered storytelling through materiality, which was called Intangible Matter, and was commissioned by Chanel and ID magazine. And I was essentially asked to create a personal response to scent within a digital space that needed to be globally accessible. And I thought this was a really exciting challenge because scent is it's one of the senses that we can't see. So it's kind of thinking about what are all the other elements within our sensorial catalogue that we could access instead. And the outcome became an interactive online experience, aka a website, which was built with WebGL. So I created spaces where the user had as much choice and control as possible, and was built similarly to a video game where you had a music-based reward at the end, and there was kind of 360-degree movement in most of the rooms, and it was all about this idea of people being able to kind of place their own memories into the space and almost try to extract myself from the work, if that makes sense. So these are kind of some of the behind-the-scenes parts of it, where you can see how two-dimensional WebGL can appear until you kind of add these moving textures and curves to make something that has a lot more physicality to it. And these are some of the tests, which is why they're like tiny GIFs. But yeah, we had to figure out ways to give a physicality to all of the objects. So the aim wasn't really to try and communicate a personal experience that I'd had with fragrance as kind of a commercial project, but more to propose future patterns for digital spaces and what the meaning could be when there's it's really trendy right now to create work that's about the senses. So thinking about how that would be going forward in the future and how we can create these experiences that actually feel relatable and like they could kind of exist in our minds beyond them existing online. So one of the more recent physical developments that I've done is called Qualia, which is kind of a fusion of these materiality and technological themes that I look at in my work. And it's essentially an interactive glass interface that seeks to challenge not just the idea of what an interface could be, but what we can potentially gain from screens for interactions and as a portal for knowledge. I was really inspired by the concept of having a piece of glass that could be interactive but be any shape, and make it feel somewhat humanized or kind of resemble something more natural than our current smart devices. So by extracting and separating materials that currently exist in our touch screens, in any kind of capacitive screen, I was able to create a responsive piece of glass that mimicked how you touched it and became this kind of magical vortex. And this was quite innovative because the technique that we used had only been used by the military before I used it, so it was the first time using it in a creative setting, and I'll show you it working in a minute. And I kind of wanted to show how the graphics of this worked as well. So I really wanted to make graphics that felt responsive, or at least appeared responsive, and kind of referenced the textures and motion that we see in reality. And then I combined this with fluid motion. So this was one of the tests that we did with the programming. We used V4 for it, and this was us just testing how the mouse would work before we started using our fingertip. So this is how it worked, essentially. So you can see that it's following your fingertips and following your touch, and kind of creating this physiological experience where I almost compare it to having a running stream and then sticking your finger in it, and it almost breaks the tension of you and the water between it. So I think to finish off and to come back to what everyone else has been talking about, I know this might seem like quite a blue sky idea, but when I was thinking about the themes within this talk tonight, I was really thinking about what we could do to create a more democratic future in terms of the difference between the fake and the true, and kind of considering ways where hopefully in the future we can maybe have a choice of when we see things that have been altered compared to when we don't, and almost being able to make decisions of when we know that we're in a digital world compared to the real world. And something that I really believe in within my work is an idea of transparency. So not just on a visual level, but something that's kind of vital to technology. So technology shouldn't be opaque, and it should be within physical and conceptual manifestations that we consider transparency. You know, I think it's all about finding ways to make sure everyone understands the small print of the devices that we have in our everyday lives. And I think based on the responses I get from my work, where people think that even the sculptures I make are rendered, I think I'm trying to create something that just renders a fantasy or a version of a reality that viewers want to believe is real, at least on some level. So I think there's so much room for development in terms of computer graphics that kind of really can go beyond simply just replicating reality. And I really think that, I think the lines will continue to be blurred in that area, but I think that we just need to be more conscious of it. And that's me done. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy.